Hey everybody, we're gonna get started. Thank you all for being here tonight and welcome to what I know will be an incredible event. My name is Annie Livingston and I'm a poetry student here in the creative writing program. I'm very excited to be able to introduce tonight's speakers, author Dr. Phan Quế Mai and actress Quyên Ngô. On behalf of the Black Mountain Institute before tonight's event, I'd like to take a moment to thank the following individuals and organizations: Miriam Shearing, the Rogers Foundation, the College of Liberal Arts, Terry Zalkman, and the Trun Thi One Gift. Thank you for making this reading possible. And now, if you haven't already, please take a moment to silence your cell phones. After the talk, Quế Mai will take a few questions from the audience and then be available to sign copies of her latest book, Dust Child. If you haven't gotten a copy yet, we have some available for purchase in the back of the room, courtesy of the Writer's Block. I'd also like to take this opportunity to invite you all to the wonderful events we have coming up, including Ahmed Nagi's reading on the 12th of April and Iman Mursal's reading on the 21st of April. With you, we would first like to acknowledge that UNLV operates from the city of Las Vegas, traditional homeland and unceded territory of the Nuwuve or the Mawapa Band of Paiute people. We encourage everyone in this space to engage in shared stewardship of the land and active learning about historical realities of colonialism and the indigenous people who continue to work and live on this land since time immemorial. Quyên Ngô is an actor, organizer, and trainer based in Los Angeles. She is the narrator of Nguyễn Phan Quế Mai's Dust Child, as well as her debut novel, The Mountains Sing, which was a finalist for the 2021 Audie Award for Audiobook of the Year. She is a translator of Vietnamese poetry and prose and believes both narration and translation work are sacred arts. Dr. Nguyễn Phan Quế Mai is an award-winning writer who has published 12 books of poetry, fiction and nonfiction, in both Vietnamese and English. Author and activist both, Quế Mai's career spans continents, genres, and histories. Her work has been translated into over 20 languages. Quế Mai's debut novel and first book written in English, The Mountains Sing, was published in 2020 to much fanfare. An international bestseller, The Mountains Sing won numerous accolades, including the 2021 Penn Oakland Josephine Miles Literary Award, and the 2020 Book Browse Best Debut Award, and a Lannan Literary Fellowship. As the best of literature aims to do, The Mountains Sing extends the work beyond the page, and the result is a story that sings personally, politically, and poetically. Quế Mai's latest novel, Dust Child, is no different. Of course, Quế Mai's literary career goes back decades. In 1983, when she was just 10 years old, she entered a mail-in writing competition with a secret visit to the post office and won. When the notice announcing her prize arrived in the mail, her parents were shocked and not a little scared. Quế Mai shares in an interview, "Due to the long history of Vietnamese writers' experiences in my country, my parents reminded me of their wish that their only daughter would not become a writer." Despite the many familial responsibilities that pulled her away from writing when she was younger, Quế Mai traces her debut novel all the way back to her adolescence, writing that the writer in her always listened to other people, always asked questions about their experiences during the war, and memorized their stories. It was those stories that would later lead her to write The Mountains Sing. Dust Child, too, is a work which exists because of Quế Mai's desire to find and share important stories. Like The Mountains Sing, Dust Child tells a series of complex and interwoven narratives, moving between perspectives and histories surrounding the Vietnam War. Published on March 14th, just over a week ago, Dust Child is already decorated as a Best Book of 2023 by Reader's Digest and Cosmopolitan, and a Best Book of Spring 2023 by Los Angeles Times and the Chicago Review of Books, among others. Dust Child has been described in the New York Times as a sweeping, decade-spinning saga, and in Shelf Awareness as a deft wielding of polyglot talents to reclaim lives too long overlooked. In Dust Child, every character, no matter their circumstances, refuses a narrative of victimhood. As a character in Dust Child says regarding Vietnamese banh mi, "When France invaded Vietnam, they brought bread. We took the bread and made it better." As I read Dust Child, I was endlessly struck by the poetry of resilience expressed in these characters. As Quế Mai writes in the novel, their narratives are bright and inexhaustible, even when such light is not immediately apparent. May we all read, write, and live too towards what is bright and inextinguishable. Who better to show us how than Quế Mai? Now please help me in welcoming Quế Mai and Quyên Ngô.
Annie, that was incredible. That is one of the best introductions I have ever had. Listening to Annie's introduction, I firmly believe we are at one of the best institutions that nurture and educate writers. I have such a great hope and strong belief in writers like you. Annie is a poet, and you can hear poetry through her introduction. So thank you so much for the honor of being here, of being among you. I think I'm one of the first Vietnamese writers who are here, right? At the Black Mountains Institute. So thank you to all the donors who make this possible. Your support is precious to literature. Your support ensures diversity in literature. We writers from Southeast Asia, from Vietnam, from Laos, from Cambodia, we need the space to tell our own stories because our stories were taken away from us and told by other people so that we only became the backgrounds to their stories. And now you help us reclaim our space to tell our stories. So I thank you, thank you, thank you. I thank you to so many people who made this event possible. You worked so hard in the past months without having met me, without knowing me and my, so you took risk by inviting me here, so I hope I won't disappoint you today. Thank you so much. And it's my honor to introduce my sister in poetry and in literature, Quyên Ngô. Quyên family left Vietnam on boats after the war and suffered a lot of trauma and a lot of loss. And growing up in Vietnam, I was told, I shouldn't be friends with people like her. Our families had been on opposite sides of the Vietnam War, and it is literature that brought us together. It was fate that my publisher chose Quyên as the narrator of my book, The Mountains Sing. And since then, we have become the best of friends. We shared love for Vietnamese music, Vietnamese poetry, Vietnamese culture, and I'm so honored that she left everything behind. Her very busy life in Los Angeles as a trainer, as an activist, and follow me on this book tour. And she has done 4 events with me, and the last 2 events are here with the Black Mountains Institute. So I'm honored to start the evening today with a poem that I wrote for my grandma. So I started my career as a poet. So I wrote in Vietnamese, and then I translated my poetry into English with the help of an American veteran, believe it or not, Bruce Weigel, who has written so much about Vietnam to protest the war after he returned. After his years of fighting in Vietnam, he returned to the U.S. and employed his poetry to speak up against the violence, and to help end the war. And he worked with me in translating my poetry. This poem is dedicated to my grandma, who died in the Great Hunger of 1945, together with nearly 2 million Vietnamese. I would like Quyên to read the poem in English first, and I will read it in Vietnamese.
The poem I can't yet name. My hands lift high a bowl of rice, the seeds harvested in the field where my grandmother was laid to rest. Each rice seed tastes sweet as the sound of lullaby from the grandmother I never knew. I imagine her soft face as they laid her down into the earth, her clothes battered, her skin stuck to her bones in the great hunger of 1945. My village was starved for graves to bury all the dead. Nobody could find my grandmother's grave, so my father tasted bitter rice for 65 years. After 65 years of searching, spirits of my ancestors led my father and me to my grandmother's grave. I heard my father call Mom for the first time. The rice field behind his back trembled. My feet clung to the mud. I listened in the burning incense, how my grandmother's soul spread, joining the earth, taking root in the field where she quietly sang lullabies, calling the rice plants to blossom. Lifting the bowl of rice in my hands, I count every seed, each one glistening with the sweat of my ancestors, their backs bent in the rice fields, the fragrance of my grandmother's lullaby, alive on each one.
Bài thơ chưa thể đặt tên. Nâng bát cơm trên tay tôi đếm từng hạt gạo. Từng hạt gạo ngọt thơm như lời ru của bà người tôi chưa hề biết mặt. Tôi hình dung khuôn mặt bà mềm mại. Khi bà được chôn vào lòng đất, quần áo tơi tả da bám chặt với xương. Trận đói năm 45 làng tôi đói mồ chôn xác chết. Mồ bà không ai biết. Bát cơm đắng miệng cha tôi 65 năm. 65 năm sau hương hồn tổ tiên dẫn cha và tôi đến trước mộ bà. Lần đầu tiên tôi nghe cha gọi mẹ, cánh đồng lúa sau lưng cha rung rẩy. Hai chân tôi gắn chặt vào bùn, nghe trong khói hương, hồn bà lan tỏa bám sâu vào rễ, mọc rễ vào ruộng đồng. Bà xe xẻ hát ru gọi lúa trổ đồng. Nâng bát cơm trên tay tôi đếm từng hạt gạo, từng hạt óng ánh mồ hôi của tổ tiên tôi còng lưng gieo gặt. Từng hạt óng ánh thơm lời ru của bà tôi đơm lên từ lòng đất. Ngoài kia trong hoàng hôn, lời ru bà tôi khe khẽ chỗ đồng. Thank you so much. Thank you. I wanted to start with poetry because the Vietnamese poet Nguyễn Duy said, the Vietnamese poet Phan Quế said, có những phút ngã lòng tôi vịn câu thơ và đứng dậy. In moments of difficulty, I hold on to the verse of poetry and pull myself up. So poetry is the pillar of the Vietnamese life. I was born 2 years before the Vietnam War ended. I grew up without much to eat. There were days that my two brothers and I and my parents were starving. But my mom made sure that I was rich in the soul. She sang lullabies to me. She read poetry to me. She told me stories. I listened to poetry every day from the public radio podcast. And in our textbooks, we always had poetry, and we learned by heart so many poems. So that's why in Das Child, I have a character, a bar girl named Chang. She is a poet. She works in a bar. She served American soldiers. She had to sell her bodies for money, but she writes poetry. Poetry gives her strength, and she memorizes Chuyện Kiều, the Tale of Kiều, an epic Vietnamese a Vietnamese novel in verse with more than 3,200 verses. She remembers by heart and can retell it and can recite it. So you know, so I started during my years of growing up in Vietnam, I wanted to be a writer because I loved reading and I loved the poetry around me. But my parents told me no, and thank you for Annie for doing that research. She did so much research instead of just reading my bio, so thank you so much. But I'm so glad I disobeyed my parents. That's why I'm here today among you. And it really feels like a dream. So, you know, growing up, my parents had a shelf filled with books that they had bought with their life's savings. So during the very difficult time when we lived under the American trade embargo, so sometimes the circumstances were so desperate, but it was the books that I could read that rescued me. Books enabled me to travel. Books opened my eyes to stories from different people, and I wanted to be a writer. So I wrote poetry in my diary. So when I go back to my parents' home today, I still have my diary there, and they're filled with you know, my very basic poetry of these days. Everything rhymed perfectly. I tried to make it rhyme. But, you know, I think that was the foundation of my career, I think, you know, trying to write poetry in my diary. But then my brothers told me, you know, we don't have enough to eat. So study and do something useful and help parents. So I went on to study business. And then I studied in Australia and came back to Vietnam. And, you know, I felt like international readers didn't know, couldn't have access to a lot of Vietnamese literature, and I was determined to show Vietnam beyond the war and Vietnam as a country with more than 4,000 years of history, you know, wonderful literary heritage. So I spent years on translating Vietnamese poetry for free. I've translated hundreds of poems during my free time because, you know, I just loved doing it. And when people offered to pay me, and I said, no, I do it because I loved it. And then I got the poetry published in the States, and I produced a poetry program here with a university radio program. But I said, okay, not many people read poetry nowadays unless you are as good as Ocean Vuong. So okay. So then I thought, okay, I need to translate a book of a novel, you know, to get more readers to read and know about Vietnam. So I was looking for a novel to translate for quite a while. And I thought, you know, I haven't found something that I could spend years translating, because as a translator, I spent a lot of time crafting each word because I understand how important each word is. So in the end, I thought, why don't I write this novel myself? Yeah, so that started, you know, that started the Mountain Sing. I wrote it with the Vietnamese English dictionary. I grew up, you know, in the rural areas of Vietnam. So my schools did not have an English teacher. So I studied it, you know, I met a teacher who provided free classes to poor kids when I was in the 8th grade, and I studied with him maybe twice a week, but a lot of the time I studied by myself with a tape recorder, because at that time my family, you know, we only had electricity maybe once a week and no TV. So I used to go to my neighbor's house whenever there was electricity, because I would stand outside their fence and hoping they would, you know, there would be a program to teach English on the radio, on the TV, so I could learn it. Because I knew English would be the key for me to enter the world. So luckily, years later, I won a scholarship to study in Australia. But still, you know, because I studied business, so when I started writing The Mountain Sing, it was really challenging. The challenges were also to speak about, you know, difficult topics of Vietnamese history. So The Mountain Sing is a journey into Vietnamese history through the lives of 4 generations of a Vietnamese family, told in the voices of a granddaughter and a grandmother and her granddaughter. So, you know, the wonderful thing about fiction is that what is missing in your life, you can make up in fiction. So, you know, because I don't have a grandma, both of my grandmas had died, you know, as in one of my poems. One of my grandma died in the Great Hunger, and another one died because of childbirth. So I don't even know how they look like. We don't even have a picture of them. So I imagine how it was like for them, their dreams and hopes. So The Mountain Sing is a result of my years of research. It took me 7 years to write this book, and it was born out of conversations I had with many elderly women in their kitchen, on their rice fields, in their garden. You know, I love listening to elderly women because they hold so much wisdom inside of them. And I think because of, you know, many topics are taboo in Vietnam, forbidden to talk about. So, you know, people haven't been able to talk about this or written about so much. For example, topics such as the land reform. So I have to confess that, you know, when my agent sold the book to my publisher, and I said, okay, now I have time to edit, I could take out the sensitive part to protect myself and my family. But in the book, Hương, one of my main characters, told herself, if I were to become a writer, I would not bend my pen to please the eyes and ears of those in power. So that's why I could not change a single word regarding the sensitive part. With Dust Child, I also had to tackle a very difficult topic. You know, sometimes I look at writers that I admire and they produce one book in 1 year. And I tell myself, why don't you be like them, you know? Write about things which are easy, you know? Then you can sell more books and you can go on tour and have fun. This is really fun because normally being a writer is very lonely. But it's also very empowering, right? Because with fiction, you can actually employ fiction and go back to the past and change something. So in The Mountain Sing, you know, my grandmother was killed in a cornfield by someone who was her former neighbor. So I did not know him, but my father told me that he had migrated to the south. So I invented a character called Wicked Ghost, and I wanted to do terrible things to him. That's the thing with fiction. You can take revenge. But I found out that I'm not a violent person. I found forgiveness instead. So that book and Dust Child is very healing for me because it makes me reflect about the trauma that my family experienced, what my parents had gone through, and it's very healing for me because my mission is to understand different people's perspectives, and you know, so that I can understand their positions better, so that I can understand why they acted the way they did. So that child really started from my, the seed of that child was planted when I was a child growing up in southern Vietnam. Some of the children in my neighborhood were mixed race children. They were born out of relationships between American soldiers and Vietnamese women. And they were abandoned at birth because the mothers couldn't raise them and the fathers had walked away from them. So they were very much bullied, looked down upon. They were considered children of the enemy. So I had empathy towards them, but I didn't dare to speak up because I was bullied myself. My family had moved from North Vietnam to South Vietnam. And before that, our country had been divided into North and South. So the Southerners didn't want to see people from the North, coming, and some of us, also we went there to take away jobs from the Southerners because the government, being the Northern Communist government, were taking a lot of positions away from Southerners and putting their own people from the North. So that's why there were reasons for resentment. And so I was bullied and I couldn't speak up for the Amerasians. So I always was curious about them. So in 2015, I read a story that moved me really deeply. An American veteran was coming back to Vietnam with an album of old photos, looking for, he was looking for the woman in the photos, the woman who was pregnant with his child and from whom he had walked away more than 40 years earlier. So then I realized that the need for these veterans to find their kids was huge, and they were getting much older. So this veteran was in his 70s. So they did not have much time left. So I reached out to an organization that helped veterans find their missing family members. So I interviewed them, and one of the veterans told me after the war, he came back to the US, and he was so traumatized that he could not find a job. He was homeless for more than 40 years. And then during the years that he was living on the street, during the winter nights, whenever he tried to sleep, he would hear his former Vietnamese girlfriend, Kim, calling him, "Alan, this is your child." And he said no, and he walked away from her. So I wrote about Alan in my article, and I asked one of the veterans, why don't you write a letter to your former girlfriend? Tell her why you had abandoned her when she was pregnant and why you're back looking for her, you have been spending your life saving, going back to Vietnam year after year after year looking for her. Because, these veterans had been on national newspapers in Vietnam. They were featured by BBC. So I thought I would not have a chance, but I thought this letter would stand out and attract people's attention. And I published because I also write for national newspapers in Vietnam. I work as a journalist as well. So I published that article and with my email, and I received so many emails. Until 3 weeks later, I received an email from a stranger. She gave me 2 phone numbers, and she said, "Quế Mai, please call me. I might know someone who might know the veteran who wrote that letter." I called her, spoke to her for more than 15 minutes, and then she told me, "Quế Mai, I'm the one in the letter." She told me for more than 40 years, she had not told anyone about her story, how she had been pregnant with a child of an American soldier, how she had worked as a bar girl to help her family survive during the war, how she had to give the child away. And she said, "There is no day that I don't think about my child." So she asked me to put her in touch with the veteran, and then they were united after 46 years. and he went back to Vietnam and met her, and it was very emotional. And they have both done DNA testing, but haven't been able to find the child. So as I speak now, tens of thousands of children who were called the dust of life would die by Vietnamese people are still looking for their parents. And so this is the article that I published. So the woman, she was very beautiful. She's still very beautiful today. And she's the one here on the left. And she couldn't believe it that she saw herself in this article. But miracles do happen in life. And there are many miracles that happen in this book. And through my imagination, but also, through my real life research, that I witnessed these miracles. And there are 4 characters in this book: a black Amerasian man in today's time, trying to search for his parents and his identity. So in his character, I want to talk about the experiences of Amerasians, what they went through, their struggles and courage, and also about them not refusing to accept that they are victims. They are the people with, even though a lot of Amerasians are illiterate, but they are beautiful, courageous people. So from my black Amerasian character, is not a victim. He's a carpenter, a loving father and loving husband, and he plays traditional Vietnamese musical instruments. So I have a lot of fun writing about him. Then I also have 2 Vietnamese sisters, because I don't have a sister in real life. I have found Quyên, my Vietnamese sister, but I wrote this book before I knew Quyên. So I made up a sister that I wanted to have. So there are siblinghood in this book. Also, because Western men have given themselves the right to write in the voices of Vietnamese women in many cases. So in this book, I said, okay, why don't I do it? Do it like them. So I challenged myself with the task of writing in the voice of a Western man, and not just a normal Western man. He's a traumatized helicopter pilot. So to write him, I had to study about helicopter. I had to interview a lot of people who, who flew helicopters during the Vietnam War. I did my PhD research about the impact of PTSD and trauma. So I learned so much during this process. And I was very lucky that, to all the students who are doing your master's here, you are so lucky. Because I did not have the chance to study until much later. The first chance I got to study creative writing really was my master's in creative writing with Lancaster University in the year 2012. But being a part of the program, you receive much needed guidance, because without my PhD, I couldn't have learned about the importance of the ethics in research. Because when you research into the topics of trauma and you interview traumatized people, you have to be really careful. You have to design your project so that it's ethical, so that you don't provoke trauma in your topics, in your research participants. So the way that I designed the questions, I got a lot of useful feedback. So it's very important. I embrace the ethics of research. So for example, even though my character is, I spoke to a veteran whose helicopter was shot down during the Vietnam War. And I was dying to interview him, because my character in that child, then his helicopter was shot down. But I knew I couldn't do that to him, because it would be too difficult for him to relive his past, so I did not interview him. I researched into secondary information which is available. There are a lot, when it's about the American experiences, you have so much materials. You have archives of materials, documentary films, yeah, many things on the internet as well and in archives. So I use many types of sources for my research, and I really believe that a job as a novelist is to plant a tree. The more research we do, the richer is the soil of our garden on which we will plant the tree, and then we will use creative techniques to build the trunks and the branches and the leaves for the trees, for our tree, and it's up to the readers to make that tree flower. So by being here today, by reading my book, you make that child flower. So thank you very much. I would like, before the Q&A, I would like to invite Quyên Ngô to read an excerpt from the book. Would you like to hear her? We are so lucky to be listening to Quyân's narration.
For Amerasians and their family members who shared with me their personal stories and who inspire me with their courage. For the millions of men, women, and children who were pulled into the vortex of the Vietnam War. For anyone whose life has been touched by violence, may our world see more compassion and peace. During the Vietnam War, tens of thousands of children were born into relationships between American soldiers and Vietnamese women. Tragic circumstances separated most of these Amerasian children from their fathers and later their mothers. Many have not found each other again. Child of the Enemy, Ho Chi Minh City, 2016. Life is a boat. Sister Nha, the Catholic nun who had raised Phong, once told him. When you depart from your first anchor, your mother's womb, you will be pulled away by unexpected currents. If you can fill your boat with enough hope, enough self-belief, enough compassion, and enough curiosity, you will be ready to weather all the storms of life. As Phong sat waiting at the American consulate, he felt the weight of hope in his hands, his visa application, and those of his wife Bin, his son Thai, and his daughter Yiem. Around him, many Vietnamese were waiting in chairs or in lines for their turn to speak with one of the visa officers who sat at counters behind glass windows. Some Vietnamese cast curious glances toward Phong, and he felt the heat of their eyes. Half-breed, he imagined them whispering. Throughout his life, he had been called the dust of life, bastard, Black American imperialist, child of the enemy. These labels had been flung at him when he was younger with such ferocity that they had burrowed deep within him, refusing to let go. When he was a child living in the Lâm Đồng New Economic Zone with Sister Nha, he once filled a large bucket with water and soap, climbed inside, and rubbed his skin with a sponge gourd to scrub the black off of it. He was bleeding by the time that Sister Nha found him. He wondered why he had to be born an Amerasian. Don't worry, be confident and you'll do well, An, Min whispered, reaching for him, the calluses on her palm brushing against his arm. Phong nodded, smiled nervously, and took his wife's hands into his. This hand had cooked for him, washed his clothes, and helped to mend the broken patches of his life. This hand had held him and his children, danced with them, yielded new seasons on their rice field. He loved this hand and its calluses as he did every part of Bin. He had to fulfill his promise to bring Bin to America, away from the rubbish dumps where she worked, collecting plastic, paper, and metals. Sitting next to Bin, Thai, and Yiem waved at him. At 14 and 12 years old, they were nearly as tall as their mother. They'd both inherited Bin's large eyes and her radiant smile. Their skin color and curly hair had come from him. "Remember that you are beautiful," he'd told them as they got ready for the 5-hour bus ride here. He'd often said that to them, knowing how they were often looked at with disdain by the Vietnamese, who almost always preferred fair skin. Thai returned to his book, his crooked glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose, the metal frame held together by pieces of tape. Phaum reminded himself to talk with his neighbors again and offer a higher price to rent their paddy field. He would grow mung beans for the new year, the harvest of which would enable him to buy new glasses for Thai and a dress for Yim. Yim was wearing Thai's old clothes. The pants were too short, revealing her ankles. At a counter in front of Phaum, an American visa officer was giving a young woman a blue sheet of paper. Phaum knew the color well. Blue meant non-approval. As the woman left the counter, something like panic rose up in Phaum. He tried to recall the interview practice sessions he'd had with his family. He had carved the right answers into his memory the way carpenters carved birds and flowers into wood, but now his mind was blank. "Number 45, counter 3, the loudspeaker called. "That's us," Bin said. As Phaum made his way toward the counter together with his wife and children, he told himself to be calm. As long as he had his family, he would not let himself be intimidated. He would fight for the chance to give Bin, Thai, and Yim a better life.